Paddington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just had a question for the member. In my view, there's been a lot of unnecessary fear-mongering in relation to COVID-19, and I say it in this context. We've seen provincial leaders, we've seen federal leaders not give us the correct clarity. We've seen case counts, death counts. Alberta, to their credit, has segmented it so that we're seeing that the majority of people who are suffering are seniors with multiple comorbidities. This information is helpful so that not everybody is afraid. Can the member tell us what could the Prime Minister have done to provide needed clarity and context so that we're not seeing young children develop mental disorders over the fear over COVID-19?
For Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola, 30 seconds.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would simply say this. Look, my leader announced a recovery plan, one that would cover both the employment, getting them over 1 million jobs, seeing supports for mental health, like a national hotline that people could call, to seeing more accountability from this government. As we've seen time and time again, there is no transparency from this Liberal government. Madam Speaker, these are the kinds of things Canadians want to hear from their leaders. And quite honestly, if this Prime Minister isn't prepared to start presenting these things, he should simply resign from the position and let someone like my leader, who knows where the country needs to go, to give hope to Canadians.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Carleton.
Thank you. Well, Madam Speaker, I want to share some good news with the House. The Seattle Mariners will host 9,000 fans. They just got approval from Washington State, a very progressive and woke state south of the border whose ideological inclinations are very similar to this government, and they have signed off on a safe plan, according to that state, to allow 9,000 fans to participate in a major sporting event in Seattle, no less. We got simultaneously the news that our Toronto Blue Jays are not going to be able to do anything similar. In fact, they put out a statement in which they said that though we had hoped for improvements in the public health outlook as we neared the 2021 baseball season, with the ongoing Canada-US border closure, we have made the difficult decision to play the first 2 homestands of the 2021 regular season at TD Ballpark in Florida. So the Floridian businesses will get all of the benefit of that major sporting event. Now, it is not just sporting events, Madam Speaker, that are reopening around the world. The Australians and New Zealanders are finalizing plans for quarantine-free travel across their borders between their 2 countries. And in Taiwan, which has pretty much the lowest COVID mortality rate on planet Earth, even though it is right next door to the country from whence COVID originated. I'm quoting here from the Brookings Institute, a progressive U.S. think tank, and I'm quoting, "Taiwan has managed the spread of COVID-19 far better than most. It suffered only 7 deaths amongst its 23.5 million people in 2020. Except for a few short weeks of lockdown in March last year, life in Taiwan has been normal. Schools, offices, and restaurants have been open as usual, although with temperature screening, hand sanitizing, and social distancing. Live concerts by Yo-Yo Ma and performances of the Phantom of the Opera have attracted thousands of people into indoor arenas." Again, all of this with 7 deaths, not 7 deaths per 100,000, not 7 deaths per million, 7 total deaths since COVID started in the country right next door to Taiwan. In fact, Canada now has 601 deaths per million. Taiwan, it's 0.42. Singapore, 5.13. Australia, 35.6. In other words, even if you just compare us to Australia among that group, we have a factor of 20 times higher deaths per capita than they do. And we have among the most severe restrictions on our lives. Now, Madam Speaker, it is easy to sort of wave one's hand and say, well, who cares about baseball or artistic conferences or travel between countries? None of those things are core to human existence, so we ought not worry about the fact that they are still largely eliminated and restricted. But the reality is, they are but symbols of the massive human sacrifice that our people are forced to make. Not only do we have a ranking of roughly 45 for vaccinations per capita, we are ranked 11 out of 15 in the misery index. That is the overall combined misery that we have suffered during the COVID pandemic, according to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And this is not just numbers and stats, it is human lives. Calls to one suicide prevention line have risen 200% over the last year, reports CBC. That has prompted Conservative MP from British Columbia to put forward a motion for a single suicide hotline. A good idea, but one that we wish we didn't have to pursue. We wish there was no need for suicide hotlines. But the University of Calgary's found that for every 1 percentage point increase in unemployment, you get a 2 percentage point increase in suicides across Canada. That is the human cost. Now, let's go not just to suicides, but drug overdoses, which have also spiked during the pandemic, up 50% in both Alberta and Ontario during the times that Canadians were forced to lock themselves down. These statistics reflect what has happened right across the country. Even the Chief Public Health Officer, Teresa Tam, wrote, Statistics Canada found lower life satisfaction among unemployed Canadians and noted that this relationship is about more than just money. She is pointing out in that statement what Canadians who are suffering lockdown in their homes or restricted from their jobs have known all along, that this is not just a massive $100 billion economic crisis, though it definitely is that. This is not just about a $400 billion deficit, by far the biggest in Canadian history. This is about people's human and very real suffering that has led to higher mortality rates in countless other areas. I think not just of the drug and opioid overdoses. I think of the suffering seniors, many of whom, through tragic stories we have all heard, have had to die alone, separated from the loved ones they have known all of their lives. I got a message from a senior recently who told me she doesn't know what she has to live for. She has not seen her grandchild in a year. She has not seen some of her children for an equally long time. Many of the activities that she enjoyed doing are now banned, and because she's over 80, she doesn't know how much time she has left. For someone in that age bracket, time is a precious and shrinking commodity, one that this government, through its incompetence in managing the COVID situation, has exacerbated day by day. This is the very real human suffering that has resulted from the government's failure to safely protect our country from this pandemic and allow us to go forward and reopen our economy while protecting human lives. You think, for example, of our friends in Israel, where the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, was on the phone at 3 a.m. with the companies that are responsible for delivering the vaccines, and as a result, he was able to deliver more than 100 vaccines for every 100 Israelis already to this day, whereas we're now around 5. Tiny Israel, a small country with endless security and economic challenges, surrounded by hostile states, many of whom are controlled by terrorists and tyrants, is managing to outperform Canada. And then we look at the other countries of the world. Singapore, a tiny island with no resources. Taiwan, right next door to the origin of the disease. And I know what liberals across the way are thinking. Sure, Israel and Taiwan and Singapore are ahead of Canada, but they're such advanced countries. How could we expect to compete with them? You know, there was a time when Canada had an advanced economy, when we were among the best places on earth in which to do business and deliver the necessities of human life. But sadly, those days are slipping away, and I fear that we are accepting slowly, as the frog in the heating water the loserdom that this government is bringing us. Highest deficit as a share of GDP in the G20. Worst vaccination rates in the G7. Highest unemployment rate in the G7. These have been the results for Canada. And there's almost a sort of a quiet acceptance that Canada can be behind the rest of the world. A country that used to be the best, the United Nations would say we were the best place on planet Earth in which to live. You don't hear people talking like that anymore. Now, they talk about Ireland, which has a GDP per capita 70% higher than Canada. A country with a fraction of the resources and land of Canada, and nowhere near the geographic advantage that we enjoy here in Canada. We have got to say enough is enough. We are not going to accept loserdom anymore. We as a country should be the best, not just at procuring vaccines and protecting our population, but at everything else. We have been blessed with more natural advantages than any country on earth, maybe than any country in the history of the world. It is time for us to hold ourselves and our government to a higher standard so that we can live up to the expectations that we as Canadians for so long had and pass on to our country, the next generation, a country that is second to none. Thank you.
The honourable member for Spadina, Fourth York.
Well, thank you. I listened to a long litany of what I assume were facts that he presented, although as a journalist, every time you hear a politician use a number with a zero at the end, you get a little nervous to round it up or round it down for political reasons. But 54% of his party can't even get their head around the facts of climate change. So I'll spare my analysis of his representation of the facts. But, he references Australia, and I'd like to know from the member opposite, whether any trucks crossed an international border to get into Australia during the pandemic, or whether nurses in a city in Australia crossed a river to get to work in another country and provide health services in a place like, say, Detroit during the pandemic and then had to return home at night. I'd like to ask the member opposite as well, as he cherry picks everything, whether his lavish, all expenses, champagne and penthouse trip to Taiwan with his wife, which was completely somehow avoided in his disclosure to the offices of Parliament, whether that sort of indulgence with free travel played a role at all in his quoting Taiwan as a country to cite around COVID.
Member for Carleton.
Well, of course, the member's smear is absolutely false, and most of his question was replete with factual errors. I can tell him that the 2,000 people that came to Canada from the most affected region of China after the military warned his government of a brewing pandemic in that country, none of them arrived by truck either. They all got here by plane, unless he is aware of a transoceanic bridge that they would have taken. No, they came here because his government left the borders open even after we warned them not to. But this member of all should not be lecturing about politicians using numbers with zeros on them. He regularly brags about how he has a $70 billion housing plan that has delivered 10,000 homeless people in his hometown of Toronto, where Toronto is now the 6th most expensive real estate market on planet Earth, even though we live in one of the least densely populated countries in the world. He has been responsible for housing in that city for the last 15 or 20 years, and he's delivered, with all the money that he's proud of spending, one of the worst possible results.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Saanich Skullfile.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm actually very interested to know what the honourable member for Carleton thinks about the approach that Australia took to its jurisdictional differences. Like Canada, Australia has very powerful state governments, as we have provinces, but they organized differently. They had their federal national public health officer, the equivalent of our Dr. Theresa Tam, at the same table with each of the provincial health officers, with their Bonnie Henrys and their Rob Strangs. I'm wondering if the honourable member thinks we might learn something about jurisdictional coordination to better approach pandemics from how Australia handled the COVID-19 crisis versus how Canada handled it.
For Carleton.
Well, certainly the Australians, like almost every other country in our peer group, had undertaken practices that we could learn from. Here in Canada, there was no doubt that there was a lack of coordination, but part of it was that the government was spreading misinformation, dangerous misinformation, right from the get-go. They told us that it was it would not help. In fact, it would harm if we closed our borders to travel from the affected countries. We later learned that they were wrong, and they now admit they were wrong about that. They actually told Canadians not to wear masks, and then they flip-flop and changed their minds on that. So I think the government's constant dissemination of false and misleading information is one of the core reasons why Canada has had such a comparatively of such a poor response to this pandemic relative to other countries.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his very thoughtful remarks here today. I also wanted to note his reflections on the impact on the human condition, whether intended or unintended, the consequences that we've seen. Certainly people are beginning to talk about a echo pandemic when it comes to mental health, stress, anxiety, depression, and suicide, and also the impacts on seniors, which he alluded to, where seniors have felt that they have lost control over their lives as they have not been involved in the decision making. I'm wondering if he could comment on these 2 points. Thank you.
Carlton, 5 seconds.
I'd like to say that that member makes a very good point, and I'm very proud to partially share a riding name with her, even though she is from the wonderful province of Saskatchewan and my riding is in Ontario. But I agree with everything she said, and I wish she had more time to say more of it. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable...
Don't forget to like, dislike, subscribe, and comment. Safe Space Cafe. And always, have a good day.